meeting of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. As you know,
thank
the
you, Chair.
meeting...
Point of order.
Recognizing point of order, Ms. Shanahan.
Yeah, I'm sorry to, I beg your pardon, but I just wanted to confirm that this is indeed a continuation of the meeting that was suspended Monday.
Thank you, Ms.
If you
Shanahan.
can confirm the speaking order, that I'm first on the speaking order today. As you said,
I thank you for the interruption, but if you just would allow me, I was just getting there. Getting back onto script, this is a continuation of the meeting that was suspended on Monday, April the 26th, 2021. We are picking up where we left off. The speaking order as it was left off as is Ms. Shanahan, followed by Mr. Sabera, followed by Mr. Fergus, followed by Monsieur Fortin, followed by Dr. Carey, followed by Mr. Dong and Mr. Angus. And I will be picking up with additional speakers as they come onto my screen. So with that, I think everyone is aware that this is the continuation of the meeting of April April 26th, and that we are debating Monsieur Fortin's motion of April the 8th. I will turn to Ms. Shanahan for our first speaker. Ms. Shanahan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. And again, I do beg your pardon, but having been inadvertently, I'm sure, left off the list when we met Monday this week, I just wanted to be sure that indeed I would have this opportunity to speak to Mr. Fortin's motion, because indeed I have a lot that I wanted to speak to that, and before I get there, I just want to put on the record that I had put forward a motion to resume debate on my motion asking for the continuation of testimony, that this committee would hear further testimony on the MindGeek study. And why did I do that? Because it has come to our attention with the very disturbing testimony that we have heard to date, including that of Melissa Lukens and the representatives of Stella, that we are just at the tip of the iceberg as far as what constitutes non-consensual use of images, and indeed what is seen in on the internet that is available publicly.
Recognizing a point of order.
Well, Ms. Shanahan didn't even give you the chance to introduce yourself, and now she's changing the subject. The subject is Mr. Fortin's motion. We have to dispose of his motion before she starts to talk about issues that have nothing to do with the motion at hand.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. I think that was a point of order with regards to relevance. Ms. Shanahan, reminder to you that we are on Mr. Fortin's motion. There was some discussion in a previous meeting that we move on to other business. There was an expectation and a hope by all members, expressing, including members of her own caucus, that we move on to other issues, as she is now indicating. But just a reminder to colleagues that in order for us to move on to other subjects, we actually have to dispose of this motion first. And so, a reminder that we are debating Monsieur Fortin's motion, and in order to move on to other things, we have to dispose of this motion. And so, the way we would do that is through a vote. And so, I'd encourage members to move to a vote if that's the desire to move on to other business. Ms. Shanahan.
Thank you, Chair. And indeed, I do have much to say about Mr. Fortin's motion. It's what I want to express here today is that on the scale of priorities, I find it very sad that this is where we're at in this committee. Parce que c'est pas juste moi, Monsieur le...
I'm not the only one, Chair. There were quite disturbing testimonies which were made, and I've got constituents who talked about this with me and have asked me what's happening with their study. And I would like to thank all the members here for the fact that we were able to call witnesses. It's been very difficult. There's other people who've come up. There's a young girl who's come up in Quebec, and she's talked. Chair, point of order.
I'm recognizing a point of order, but even before the point of order, I have cautioned you, Ms. Shanahan, that we are on the subject of Monsieur Fortin's motion. If you'd like to debate other things, I'll have to move to the next speaker on Monsieur Fortin's motion, so that we can dispose of that motion before we can move on to another issue. So, Ms. Shanahan, I'll allow you to have the floor once I've recognized this point of order. But I would caution you that you must return to the debate with regards to Monsieur Fortin's motion before we can move on to other business. Monsieur Fortin.
Ça va, Monsieur le Président?
Thank you, Chair. You have said what I was going to say. We're on the same wavelength, Chair.
I think that there has been some level of frustration that we haven't been able to focus as committee members on the issue at hand, and as has been expressed, including your own current speech, Ms. Shanahan, the frustration that we can't move on to other issues. And so I just would like to remind you and other members, the only way that we can move on to those important issues is if we in fact vote on this motion. So, Ms. Shanahan, I'll caution you to speak to the motion. If you have nothing to speak to with regards to the motion, I'd ask that you cede your time to the next person on the list. We do have an extensive list that has developed. Ms. Shanahan.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Well, instead of discussing about points that are considered to be important by people, it's true, yes, we are here to discuss Mr. Fortin's motion. I find this motion to also be very disturbing because, once again, instead of listening to the people who are the victims, we seem to want to create other victims. And why am I saying this? It's because here we're talking about a motion which said that we should summon employees, parliamentary staff and political assistants to come and testify before this committee for no reason other than the fact that they were carrying out the tasks that they had been given. So I would like to focus in particular on certain points in Mr. Fortin's motion. In particular, point number three, where it says the committee confirms that it has not released these witnesses from their obligation to appear. I find this very rich, in particular for this committee, where there's already a history of obliging innocent people who are not involved. And let's be clear and honest about this. It's all about the situation related to the Canada Student Service Grant. That program didn't work, but it seems that we've really blown this up for partisan gain. So this point is clearly saying that there's people here who did not accept the fact that ministers came who have ministerial responsibility vis-a-vis these members of staff, and it's the ministers that came before the committee. And I will say a great deal about what we heard at that point in time. But apparently that wasn't sufficient for Mr. Fortin. This wasn't enough for him. He wants to add another layer to this. He's saying here that he does not want to release these witnesses who are simple employees. And I think that's really unacceptable, in particular, given that I think that the bloc is there to defend the rights of workers. And the same party is now saying that staff members who have applied for a job and who have received a contract of employment which has to respect certain matters, and they've signed up to this job and they're responsible for certain matters, but the buck stops with the employers. It's the employers that are responsible for the big decisions that are taken. Now, Chairman, I was able to be a trade union representative during my career, and never would I have accepted for an employee to be actually compelled to answer in front of anyone when it comes to decisions and actions undertaken by their employers. I would never have accepted that. Thus, I find it very difficult to grasp the Bloc's position on this particular issue. I find it hard to comprehend that they do not even want to release these witnesses. The request has been made and an option was offered up whereby these employees could have answered certain questions in writing if it was a matter of information. And I've got plenty to say on that as well, as to why employees can sometimes be asked to provide some information. But no, that was not accepted, that option. No, they want us to summon them before the committee. Now, Chair, I believe that the sole reason for doing this is to try and intimidate these people and put questions to them and try to come up with some sort of narrative around these people who were simply doing their job. And of course, this leads me on to the question of roles and responsibilities of the assistants and the public officials and ministers. When we say, yes, a parliamentary committee can request for a public official who is an accountable agent answerable to an organisation could then be requested to come before the committee to answer certain questions about the running of a given department. And often they do this together with their minister. Point of order here.
Recognizing a point of order, Monsieur Fortin.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairman, I submit that our colleague Ms. Shanahan is still out of order. The decision that we need to take here at this committee is not to determine whether or not the witnesses were called upon to appear, either in writing and in person. This was a debate that took place on the 25th of March by members in the House of Commons. The motion that is under consideration right now is yes or no, should we be reporting to the House the fact that the order was not honoured and upheld? We're not disputing whether or not that took place in the first place. This is out of order. I think the discussion should be focusing on whether or not we should be reporting back to the House of Commons. That's the motion. On a point of order, Mr. Chairman, after Mr. Fortin has finished.
Same point of order, Mr. Fergus.
Oui, mais c'est une autre interprétation.
Yes, it is, but I have another take on that.
Mr. Fergus, I'll hear your submission on the point of order.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think it's highly relevant, in fact, what my colleague is proposing, because she is establishing a link between, well, how relevant Mr. Fortin's motion is or is not. And she's establishing the fact that the premises on which the motion is based are not valid. That's why she's raised that issue. Now, whether or not Mr. Chairman, you agree with me or Mr. Fortin. The fact of the matter is that Ms. Shanahan is in fact responding to your request, that i.e. that her comments are germane to the motion.
Yeah, I do believe that she's on the subject more than she was earlier in the meeting, and so I'm going to again remind the honourable member to be aware that her colleagues are anxious to move to a vote, but I'll allow her to continue. Ms. Shanahan.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, with that as a backdrop, I think that this is very apropos because we were referring to point 3 of Mr. Fortin's motion specifically. Now, the employee's role when it comes to appearing before and responding to a committee, well, the minister is always accountable. The buck stops with the minister at the end of the day. And since the buck stops with the minister, well, and that is, in fact, within the purview of the minister, he's accountable or she's accountable. But the fact of the matter is that the minister is entitled to delegate to an employee in certain circumstances. And that was a practice, in fact, that dates back many years in the House. Now, employees who are political attachés or assistants, if you will, well, it's very apropos for them because they are sometimes political advisors. They are in charge of the communications portfolio, and they deal with stakeholders in the community when it comes to policy matters. But at the end of the day, those individuals remain employees. They can be laid off or dismissed at any given point in time. And there, of course, is always a system of rules and regulations in place, which includes disciplinary measures. But the fact remains that at the end of the day, that's how things are. Employees might take up a post one day and leave the next. Now, the minister, however, is an elected representative, has been delegated this task by the Prime Minister and is accountable. It's not just the Liberals that are saying this. It's not just me saying this. We know that in 2010, when the Harper government was in power, Minister Jay Hill clearly stated that political attachés should not normally appear before committees. And I'll repeat in English.
These are accountable to their superiors and ultimately to their minister for the proper and competent execution of their duties. Bien suivi avec.
And he went on to say,
to be made that accountability of political staff ought to be satisfied through ministers. Ministers ran for office and accepted the role and responsibility of being a minister. Staff did not. Donc, je sais que.
So, to sum things up, well, I think that speaks for itself, doesn't it? And perhaps we could ask Mr. Hill to come and appear before us and elaborate on that. He went on to say,
servants, ministerial staff are not accountable to Parliament for governmental policies, decisions, or operations. Any information given by ministerial staff on these topics would be on behalf of their minister. Moreover, unlike public servants, ministerial staff are not involved in departmental operations and are therefore not in the same position to answer
Point of order,
questions.
Mr.
Chair. Recognizing a point of order, pardon me, Mr. Carey.
That relevance again, Mr. Chair. We're not debating whether or not the validity of these individuals are were at committee. Mr. Fortin was very clear. This was an order from the House. All we're doing is reporting these events to the House and expressing our dissatisfaction that the House's instructions were not followed through. So I find it hard to understand where the relevance is in the current argument that Ms. Shanahan is bringing forward.
I think that there's a growing agreement that the members of the committee want to debate the motion at hand, and so Ms. Shanahan, I will caution that while you may be on subject material that's tangential to the issue, we are debating the specific motion, and so I'd encourage you to move to debates with regards to the motion itself.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will return to the fact that it is the point number 3 in Mr. Fortin's motion that I am discussing right now, because we have said in that point number 3, and I'll say it in English, that the committee confirms it has not released these witnesses from their obligations to appear. So I am right on that point in that political staff, I'm discussing their roles vis-a-vis the minister. That is not for political staff to be held responsible in this way. It's not just me that said it. Mr. Jay Hill also spoke at length about this. And so Mr. Hill again, he has some good quotes here. The tyranny of the opposition has turned its attention to the men and women who make up our political staff, men and women who did not sign up to be tried by a committee, to be humiliated and intimidated by members of parliament. I really would like to have Mr. Hill in front of this committee. Anyway, puis c'était pas juste lui.
And it wasn't just him. There was also the former clerk, Rob Walsh.
Testified in 2010 at this very committee, apparently, ethics, on the same issue that in regard to staff, there would be limitations on the questions that could be asked, and that there would be some questions that should be properly directed to the minister and not to the political staff person. And so that is why on this point number 3, I object to it heartily, and I think that is something which has been discussed already by some of my colleagues. Monsieur Fortin devrait reconsidérer.
Mr. Fortin should rethink his motion in its entirety, to my mind at least, but at the very least he should focus in on certain points and tweak them. Now, in the same vein of this understanding of roles and responsibilities of staffers, when it comes to any government decision, cabinet, ministers, and as a point of fact, it was the Honourable Pablo Rodriguez who stated before our committee, and I have it in English here.
The principle of Canada's form of responsible government is ministerial responsibility. And this is the exercise in transparency that has been done here. We have gone even a step further. Ministerial staff have no authority to make decisions on behalf of ministers. They report to and are accountable to ministers. Ministers are accountable for their actions to Parliament, and I will leave it to Pablo Rodriguez to have put forward a quote from, indeed, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, as he stated in Accountable Government, a guide for ministers. Ministers are accountable to Parliament for the exercise of their responsibilities, whether they are assigned by statute or otherwise. Ministers are personally responsible for the conduct and operation of their office. Staff are not elected members of the House. They do not have the same rights and privileges as MP. And calling staff to testify at committee is at odds with a long-standing principle of ministerial responsibility. Donc, je sais que c'est pas un enjeu qui...
Now, I know this is not an issue that's important to the Bloc Québécois, and we know why. The Bloc members, who I consider good friends now, they say, well, we're never going to form a government, so we have a special role to play here. We're the Bloc Québécois, that's what we're here for. But the Conservatives and the New Democrats, well, who knows what may occur in the future when it comes to those parties, but at some point they may indeed form government. And we're talking about principles here, about traditions, conventions that, Mr. Chairman, we cannot just cast aside just for a got-you moment, petty partisan politics. Even, of course, that doesn't strictly speaking exist, does it? But that's what's occurring here. We know that the Honourable Pablo Rodriguez appeared before our committee, and we heard his testimony. As it turns out, he referred specifically to the case of Mr. Rick Tace. And he discussed the issue that was so worrisome in the eyes of certain members of this committee. And when Mr. Rodriguez said, concerning decisions in relation to We Charity, and I quote, our government has handed over over 5,000 pages of documentation to the Standing Committee on Finance of the House of Commons, and we did that in August of last year, 2020. As far as Mr. Tace is concerned, as those documents demonstrated, he had one single interaction with We Charity, a telephone call.
So, it's very important to take note of this as well, because it links up with what I said earlier about the relationship between employees and employers. Whatever employees do, even if we're not aware of all of the details, but everything that the employee does, well, it's the employer that's going to be held responsibility and the duty to be aware of what employees are doing. So that is what the Honourable Pablo Rodriguez shared with us when he came before us. I believe it was on the 29th of March this year. Then he said on Mr. Tace, as the documents have shown, he had one interaction, one phone call with We Charity. And that was disclosed by the Prime Minister's cabinet himself. So this should not take anyone by surprise several months later. According to Mr. Tace, the call lasted around 25 minutes. We Charity talked about their work that was underway with diversity, inclusion and youth, and talked about the Canada Summer Student Program. and also talking about social entrepreneurship. Mr. Tice asked how their proposal on summer grants would guarantee the diversity of internships. Then we, the Kielburgers, expressed their concern about the fact that this type of program had to get going soon. And during this communication, there was no moment in time where there was any discussion about spending, about expenditure, nor was there ever any commitment or assurance or advice given by Mr. Tice to we on any subject at all, other than just contacting the officials concerned within the Diversity, Inclusion and Youth Department. So, Mr. Tice has done his job. That's what he needed to do. He had to be a communication link with, I imagine, lots of hundreds of interveners on these different programs that were underway at that point in time. And Mr. Kielburger was one of the people with whom he had taken a phone call, a 25-minute phone call, with a reference to consult with the officials concerned in the Diversity, Inclusion and Youth Department. So basically, that was the testimony that we received from the Honourable Mr. Rodriguez on that particular day. And the members here in the committee will recall that that was not the only meeting. There were two others as well for two other employees. Now, who had been summoned? It wasn't Mr. Chin. I believe it was Mr. Singh firstly, and then afterwards Mr. Chin. And then the same principle was applied with the Honourable Mona Fortier. She came before the committee. She was on our Zoom screens, and she was ready to testify, namely to shoulder her responsibilities, as should be the case. And it's important to take note that, Chairman, you talked with the members, and it was the members here who decided not to listen to Ms. Fortier. That is unfortunate, because I believe that she was ready to talk to us as to what she knew about the interactions of these two employees. And Mr. Fortin, there again, is saying that the committee is confirming that it has not released these witnesses from their obligations to appear before us. That was not sufficient for Mr. Fortin. Now, I would like to continue on this principle of ministerial accountability and the fact that they are ministers. It's not just any old person who can speak on behalf of any other person. As Mr. Rodriguez clearly explained, this was a decision that was taken. Now, I don't need to repeat what happened last year with lots of different programs that needed to be launched in this emergency situation because of the onslaught of the COVID crisis and the accompanying economic crisis. But for those of you who've already worked in a big company, I'm sure you can imagine the fact that this was a real challenge for employees at all levels to be able to continue with their work. And in order to do this, there needed to be management to point them in the right direction. And there needed to be reassuring leadership. The Government of Canada, I believe, is the biggest employer in Canada. It's like a really big boat, big ship, and we had to try and turn this ship around. It wasn't an easy thing to achieve, but fortunately, we have our principles and our parliamentary traditions. So, as we've seen in other crisis situations, for example, in the United States, there was some general who said, no, I'm in charge. But no, that was not the case here, not at all. There's a hierarchy that's in place and there's a way of working that's been established. And these are founded on parliamentary principles, and namely it's the government and the Prime Minister together with all of his ministers who do this. Once again, as I said earlier, perhaps there are some members here now who were there back in the day when there was a difficult period for Prime Minister Harper. All of this didn't just suddenly appear overnight. We've had partisanerie in these political situations before, but back then it was Jay Hill, the leader of the government, who said in the House and explained in the House why the Harper government was not going to allow its political attaches to go to appear before committees. And I read this out in English again.
Said, when ministers choose to appear before committees to account for their administration, they are the best source of accountability, and they must be heard. Public servants and ministerial staff support the responsibility of their ministers. They do not supplant it. They cannot supplant it. Ça, c'est très important.
I think that's very important. Not just that a minister has to be able to report and explain why they've taken a certain decision, but they have to be listened to when they offer to come before a committee to testify. So I really hope, well, I find it very regrettable that when Minister Foti came not once but twice before our committee, that we actually refused to listen to her. There were political games underway so that we were not able to listen to Minister Foti because we could have listened to her answers at those points in time. And it's not just people in the Ottawa bubble that are concerned or affected by this principle of ministerial responsibility. There are other comments from people who work in this area. There's academic experts as well who've got a great deal to say on this because, of course, the Canadian public is concerned about this. If they believe that the government has taken an incorrect decision, then they want to find a scapegoat. Would they just pick on an employee somewhere? No. Rather, it's up to the government It's up to the Prime Minister and his ministers, because the Prime Minister can delegate responsibilities to his ministers. That's the principle of solidarity within the cabinet that applies. And Mr. Fergus, my colleague, mentioned that some meetings back, and that's another very important principle. Now, I do not wish to cite too many other people, but when I read through all this and when I did my research, there were questions amongst the public that referred to this principle and this tradition of ministerial accountability. And about the ministers being held accountable. It was Mr. Dale Smith, amongst other people, who said,
Conservatives are very much aware of this fact as they encountered these very same demands to have their own staffers appear during their time in government. And they also correctly asserted that ministers are the ones who should be appearing to answer questions and not those staffers. It is a fundamental cornerstone of how our system works. But because our parties are more interested in scoring as many cheap political points as possible, they are deliberately ignoring.
Recognizing the point of order, Mr. Angus.
Yes, well, since the Liberals have decided that they are going to obstruct committee and not allow us to get onto things like the facial recognition technology, I'd like to remind the member who has, I think, been very rude from the get-go that the issue of ministerial responsibility is something that the Liberals have already spoken of multiple times. She's just repeating the same old story. If she has nothing new to add, can we go to a vote so we can get back to our work?
There seems to be a hope that we can move to a vote. Is there consent to move to a vote at this time? Seeing some positive signs, but seeing some people that don't seem to want to have the vote. Folks, I do need unanimous consent to move to a vote before the speaking list is expired or has been fully done. And just a reminder, Ms. Shanahan, that behind you, you do have Mr. Sobero, Mr. Fergus, Monsieur Fortin, Mr. Carey, Mr. Dong, Mr. Angus, and Madame Latanzio, as well as Mr. Barrett, and that would like to speak. And so I'm hopeful that you'd be mindful of that. I do hope that we can move to a vote and dispose of this motion so we can move to more pressing matters. Ms. Shanahan, we'll turn back to you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's very regrettable that there's some people here who think that we should talk about other matters, because I too would have liked to have talked about other things.
But the motion we have before us, it's Mr. Fortin's motion, and it is about not releasing these witnesses from their obligation to appear before this committee. And that's the point that I wanted to tackle. And I'll just complete my remarks.
Politicians, I think, of all stripes, are not too concerned about the whiff of hypocrisy that surrounds these demands, possibly because they may require a dose of shame that pretty much every politician seems to be lacking in this day and age. So, c'est ça, je pense que...
So, basically, you have a very honest comment. He's a straight shooter. He's a member of the public who's calling a spade a spade. And in a way, what he's saying to us, honourable members of Parliament, that we should be careful about riding roughshod over these conventions and traditions. They don't belong to us. They belong to the Canadian people. And we're there to look after them.
Traditions, and we try to act as best we can. So, encore une fois.
So, once again, I'm far from being an expert on the issue. So I decided to do a bit of research, and it's the Secretariat of the Treasury Board of Canada that reported to the government. I believe it was in 2005. And the report was an overview of ministerial responsibilities and that of officials and also senior officials. And I'll read it because it's in English. I'll read it out loud in English.
View of the accountability and responsible government, that any discussion of accountability in our constitutional system, the Westminster system of parliamentary democracy, must be informed by an understanding of how the system functions and why. Because although the Westminster system developed incrementally, rooted in evolving democratic values rather than an abstract or static concept, it has deep integrity, and the roles of different players complement each other in a fine balance. And I think c'est ça qui est très important.
And that brings us to the crux of the matter. And I consider myself fortunate that I'm a Quebecer and that I was educated in Quebec. And in the course of my studies, of course, I studied our history and also our parliamentary system, how it evolved, as well as the legal system, which is different. We've got the common law in outside Quebec, and then within Quebec, there's the civil code. And my colleague knows full well that in the civil code, everything is written out in black and white. And there's a lot to be said for that kind of system. But elsewhere in Canada, and also in our parliamentary system writ large, there's this whole development of traditions that have evolved over time, where there's an element of accountability.
Again, ministers who together as the ministry form the government, of the day, exercise executive authority in this system. And that, le pouvoir exécutif.
Executive authority, that's an important notion. We're talking about the government, the cabinet, that has that power.
Actually, through the work of a non-partisan public service, are accountable to Parliament, both individually and collectively. All accountabilities in Canadian government flow from ministers' individual and collective accountability to Parliament. Although Parliament does not exercise executive authority, it is the principal guarantor of the government's accountability, scrutinizing the government's policies and actions, and holding it to account. J'ai pas besoin de décrire ça à l'opposition.
I don't need to spell it out for the opposition. You do so very well for yourselves.
Spectrum of tools for doing this, ranging from its role in the passage of legislation to the review and approval of public expenditure to the interrogations of question period. And I'm going to come back to question period a little later. But while the specific tool may vary, the environment remains constant, that of partisan politics. Parliament and its processes are inherently political, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's exactly the nature of partisan politics that each party presents a to my mind, different set of options, an alternative, a different vision to the Canadian people. The political responsibility of ministers or accountability to Parliament is an important element of electoral democracy. However, political responsibility is not the mechanism that ensures accountability on the part of public servants. That mechanism is managerial. Donc, encore une fois, le fait que c'est très...
So once again, the fact is that it is a crucial notion that ministers and that the government is responsible for managing the government apparatus in its totality.
Is also not a means of determining civil or criminal liability for unlawful conduct. That is the justice system. Donc, il y a quand même un moyen.
So, if there are employees who do something egregious and criminal, there is the justice system that's standing there waiting to intervene. And I'll just conclude on point 3, if I may. Once again, I think I've dealt with this particular issue, that is point 3 in the motion. The committee confirms that it has not released these witnesses from their obligation to appear. I think that I've made valid arguments as to why this committee should have no reason to compel these individuals, these everyday employees, staffers, to appear before us, and that in fact that the obligation to respond to questions on issues affecting or having to do with the government, well, that is the purview of the minister. And Mr. Minister Rodriguez, now had the committee agreed to hear from him, or rather had the committee agreed to hear Minister Fortier, and that is why I stand against point 3 of Mr. Fortin's motion. Some might think, well, ministers aren't that important here. And I move on to point 4. The committee also noted the absence of the Prime Minister, who was given the option of appearing in place of these witnesses in the motion of March 25th, 2021. But once again, as I argued in my earlier remarks, the Prime Minister is within his rights, fully within his rights. In fact, he ought to be delegating these responsibilities to his ministers. And on page 10 of the document, published in 2015 by the Secretariat of the Treasury Board.
Speaks now to the collective responsibility of cabinet. So collective ministerial responsibility refers to the convention requiring coherence and discipline of the ministry in deciding policy, managing government operations, and speaking to Parliament with a single voice. Pas le Premier ministre puis les...
Not the Prime Minister and the ministers separate, but everyone singing from the same songbook in unison. And I don't think this is a written rule, but it's a convention that if there is a minister that does not agree with the Prime Minister's decision, well, that individual can quite simply step down, resign. It's as simple as that. And there's an example of that convention at play in question period. But I'll come back to that in a little bit later, because I noticed that this particular report refers to ministerial staffers. So I think this is interesting.
Staff. One area that merits specific mention is the appropriate role of the minister's office in communicating and transmitting instructions to the department. The role of, in Canada, political staff, also known as exempt staff, while partly occupied with parliamentary and constituency work, also play an important but limited role in the operation of the department. And it was Gordon Robertson, a former clerk of the Privy Council, who described the role of the Prime Minister's office, which can be extrapolated to all ministers' office, as partisan, politically oriented, yet operationally sensitive. The role of political staff is to provide strategic partisan advice, and partisan being not, the meaning that we've all come to associate it with now, des trucs partisans.
It's become a dirty word, partisan politics.
It's representing your party. It's representing the party of that is in power, that has the government. And that's really the only transparent way to be, because it would be very deceptive if a party ran on a platform of saying one thing and then did something completely different. That is not what Canadian people expect. So partisan advice to the minister that complements the professional, expert, and nonpartisan advice that comes from the deputy minister and the public service at large. Exempt staff are not part of the executive. And accordingly, exempt staff have no authority to give direction to public servants. Exempt staff are there to transmit the minister's instructions. And it should also be noted that the minister is accountable for anything done in his or her name by exempt staff. It is the minister that must be heard. So that is, if anyone is interested, I found that on the website for the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. J'ai mentionné tantôt.
I mentioned earlier that it is interesting, nevertheless, to see how the parliamentary traditions have evolved over time. And it's very interesting also to see how Quebec has adopted these same traditions with a specific Quebec flavour, with a Quebec twist, and often in a very avant-garde way, which then opened up a new path for us. But just for the sake of interest, I looked up the website of the National Assembly of Quebec to see if this same principle exists there within the National Assembly for the Government of Quebec, and the answer is yes. There we find ministerial responsibility on an individual basis. It's written in very small writing. It says that the ministers are individually responsible for each of their departments. Point of order, Chair, says Mr. Fortin. Mr. Fortin? I don't want to repeat myself, but we're far off from the point. In all respect for Ms. Shanahan, this is not what we're talking about. You're trying to persuade us that the order that was given by the House on the 25th of March was not relevant. Fine, but this is a fact. This is an order that was handed down. So the question now is, are we going to say to the House that the witnesses didn't come or not? Do we want to hide it? I know that there is this habit out there amongst Liberals to hide a certain number of things, but I don't think we should do this. The question is whether we summon these people or not. Well, that ship has sailed on the 25th of March. All of the MPs, the 338, could actually speak then, and this has been dealt with. So our role today is to decide whether yes or no we're going to report the fact that these witnesses did not appear before us. That's the only question at stake here. Chair.
It's a continuation of debate. Ms. Shanahan, you have now spoken for an hour, and as you can clearly see, there is a sense of disorder that's starting to develop as a result of not being able to move on to additional speakers and move to the vote. Ms. Shanahan, are you getting close to the end of your comments?
Monsieur le Président.
Chair. I do understand that it's frustrating for colleagues. I've done my research because I knew that we were discussing Mr. Fortin's motion, so I did my homework. So please be patient.
Do you believe that we'll be able to move to a vote today, Ms. Shanahan?
Je peux pas parler pour les autres collègues.
I cannot speak on behalf of other members. I know there are other people on the list after me, and as I didn't have the opportunity to speak the other day, I would like to continue with my comments.
I'll turn back to you, as is your right. I just would remind colleagues that we've now been debating this motion for several days. And again, Ms. Shanahan, you have now spoken for over an hour. I'd encourage you to just out of respect for your colleagues, to allow them to get on the record as well. Ms. Shanahan.
Merci beaucoup. Puis c'est sûr.
Thank you very much. I think I have almost finished. But as I said, I've done my research and I'd like to continue, but thank you. Because to come back to this principle, why do we say then in point 4? Why do we make this statement that the committee also noted the absence of the Prime Minister, who was given the option of appearing in place of these witnesses in the motion of March 25th, 2021? But in fact, I think this doesn't make any sense, because the Prime Minister has the full right, and this happens on a daily basis during question period. And also this happens in other jurisdictions as well, that it's understood that the Cabinet speaks with a single voice, and each minister is responsible for defending the decisions that are taken. I think that's an interesting point. I had thought of setting up an interesting link here, because even in parliamentary legislative assemblies, which are not necessarily the same as ours within the federal parliament, I thought it was interesting to see that the same principle applies. It doesn't just apply to us. This really is a true parliamentary-wide principle. And I think that I'll continue with my research to look into how this works elsewhere as well. However, to return to our Government of Canada, there's this question of ministerial solidarity, which is the principle of collective ministerial responsibility, and that allows the ministers to appear before the cabinet, but they have to support the government's decision in public, even if they disagree in private. So this is their duty, to appear before committees such as our committee. And this is what Mr. Rodriguez and Madame Forti did, in spite of the fact that we decided not to hear from the Honourable Minister Forti. So the ministers are responsible towards the Parliament for the acts of their government, and they have to defend governmental policies. And of course, we understand that when we're referring to policies, we can understand this in terms of developing programs in a wider sense. Because basically, what are policies? Well, at the end of the day, it's a suggested approach to resolve societal problems. That's a policy. So we then recommend different ways of acting. And in order to implement them, we have to then develop programs, amongst other things, such as the program for the Canada Student Grant Program, which didn't work. It was one program amongst hundreds of programs, I believe, that were rolled out since the beginning of the pandemic. But the ministers, even if it didn't work, the Prime Minister and the responsible ministers came out and said exactly what had happened. And we know how many hours and how many documents and testimonies have been produced vis-à-vis this unfortunate program. Then the role of the cabinet is to provide information to the Prime Minister that he needs in order to perform his responsibilities. So as I've said, there's always this solidarity between the ministers and the Prime Minister. And thus, once again, I do not therefore understand the relevance of point 4 in Mr. Fortin's motion. And sometimes we have to state the obvious, because sometimes we don't realize that we're not answering the question that's being put. Sometimes, in fact, the question is right in front of our nose, nevertheless. And then on oral questions, we have that every day, and we've seen how this has evolved in the way in which question period is conducted with our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Namely, the accepted convention was always that when the opposition puts a question, they may well want the Prime Minister to answer, but it can be another minister who steps in and answers a given question. And that's part of this cabinet solidarity principle. This is a tradition which can evolve over time. And we've seen that with the innovation pursued by Mr. Trudeau, because normally on Wednesday, I think he started to do that back in 2015, as soon as Mr. Trudeau arrived in power. And he answers all the questions from the opposition on a Wednesday. But it's also his right to decide to not be there, and other ministers can then answer these questions. Once again, it is the same purpose that's achieved. Because as we've said here, This is part of the procedures and the habits of the House from the third version in 2017. I hope it's the most recent one, Chapter 11 on various questions, because in reality, the questions are put to the government as a whole, even if normally they are addressed to a specific minister, and so the government can designate the minister that will answer a given question, and the Speaker can not force a particular minister to respond to a particular question. The Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, or a minister acting on behalf of the Prime Minister.
The point of order, Mr. Barrett.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So the member opposite is offering her explainer, but on relevance, the matter that we're dealing with is an order of the House and not the procedures of the House in question period, for example. And so it's not debatable to conflate the two. They couldn't have less to do with each other. And so the principles that the member has stated notwithstanding, and we've heard them for over 1 hour, while she started her comments saying that she would like to deal with other issues, that is disingenuous. This is a filibuster, and she is not speaking to the matter at hand. She's reading us the Green Book. She might as well read us the phone book.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Ms. Shanahan, I will rule that speaking about question period generally is out of order.
C'est regrettable que mon
Well, it's regrettable that my honourable colleague is saying
Green Book is equivalent to the phone book. That is not the appreciation of the rules of the House that we have on this side of the aisle, Mr. Chair. But I was just using the practice at question period as an illustration of how that concept, principle of ministerial, of cabinet solidarity, of delegation, if you will, by the Prime Minister is totally acceptable and common practice, and indeed why point number 4, why I am against and I disagree with the point number 4 in Mr. Fortin's motion that wants to
point of order.
Recognizing the point of order, Mr. Angus.
Yes, we have sat patiently now through most of a meeting that Ms. Shanahan's not going to allow anyone else to speak. But to my colleague, Mr. Barrett, who pointed out about her use of question period, she continued to explain. If she wants to use the question period rules, then she'd run out of time for her speech. But I think, again, she needs to stop repeating and regurgitating the same tired points and allow other people to speak. It's a basic issue of respect.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. I think that Ms. Shanahan is effectively arguing with me in my decision to rule that her former discussion was off topic. I'd caution Ms. Shanahan that she should return to the subject at hand and the motion that is before the committee.
Well, indeed, Chair. Again, I was just trying to use an illustration, but I would agree with some of my colleagues. I would rather be discussing something as Mr. Boulouris of the NDP would rather us be discussing, which is the continuing study of MindGeek and Pornhub. And we had offered an option to do that, where we could have just one more meeting, have more witnesses come in who would discuss the dark web.
Point of order.
Point of order, recognizing the point of order.
Yeah, well, we did give Ms. Shanahan one more meeting and then she cut off the witnesses. But the reason I'm raising this is she started by changing the subject on the 410 motion. Now she's run out of topics. She's going back to the issue of another subject. If she's not going to speak to the subject, she needs to give the floor so that other members of this committee have a chance to speak to this motion. I'm here to speak to this motion and get it disposed of so we can get on to business.
Mr. Sobera, on the same point of order or a different point of order?
Say, well, on Charlie's point of order, it seemed like more of a point of debate.
Mr. Sobera, did you have a point of order, Mr. Sobera?
I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sabera. Thank you, Mr. Angus. Ms. Shanahan, you can understand that there is a growing desire to move on with the speaking list. I will remember, Ms. Shanahan, that as I instructed you earlier, there is no way that we can move forward with other subject material until such time as we've disposed of this motion. So I'm not sure if that was a direct comment to me as the chair, but I will remind committee members that the only way that we can move on to other subject material, as has been expressed as a desire of most members of this committee, is if in fact we can move to a vote on this motion. The only way we can move to a vote on this motion is if in fact nobody's left in the speaking order. Ms. Shanahan, you've now spoken for over an hour. If you'd like to move to other subject material, we have to exhaust the speaking list as we have it now, and then go to a vote, and then we can move on to other subject material. So I'm not sure if those comments were directed to me or to other committee members, but just a reminder to you that you are the only person standing in the way to moving forward to other issues is those on the speaking order, specifically you at this point, Ms. Shanahan.
Thank you, Chair. And there are actually other options that were discussed and put forward on to deal with this motion, and one being that Mr. Fortin could withdraw his motion, and that we just note.
Ms. Shanahan, I've addressed that before. It is not possible for Mr. Fortin to withdraw this motion. It requires unanimous consent to have this motion withdrawn. So I don't want to start an argument with you. The way that I see that we can dispose of this motion is to go to a vote. If that's not your desire, then I'd ask that you make your points. We'll complete the speaking list, and then hopefully we can get. But Monsieur Fortin does not have the privilege at this point to withdraw this motion without unanimous consent.
Well, Chair, I do have a lot more to say about Monsieur Fortin's motion, but in the spirit of collegiality, I will yield the floor at this time.
Mr. Sabera.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, colleagues. We are obviously spending a lot of time looking and speaking to Mr. Fortin's motion, and I know many of us would like to, move on to other material. Obviously, when looking at this motion, there's a fundamental disagreement in terms of how we interpret rules and responsibilities in terms of where responsibility stops at or ends at. It's very apparent that for me, during this, or for myself personally, during this entire time that we've been looking at Mr. Fortin's motion, and with regards to this motion, obviously applies to the matters at hand in terms of studying the other subject matter with regards to the Canada Student Services Grant and the events there past, that we continue to spend an enormous amount of the committee's time on something that we could have, could quickly dispose of with unanimous consent by the committee. Obviously, Mr. Fortin would have to ask for that to withdraw his motion, so we could move on to other more pertinent and I would say more important topics at hand, or potentially a committee member could offer up an amendment that we could debate and look at to maybe get to a point where an actual vote could take place. And I think the reason I would love to obviously move on and get to another point, but I'm also very stuck on the fact that I do believe in ministerial responsibility. The prior prime minister, prior to the current prime minister, commented on that. I think it's been read into the script, and I was reading it. And the prior Right Honourable Stephen Harper at the time said, "Mr. Speaker, our precedents and practices are very clear. It is ministers and the ministry at large who are responsible to the House, to its committees, not their staff members. The staff members are responsible to the ministers and the members for whom they work. So for me, it's very specific. I'm on that tangent. I don't see any other way of looking at the situation we're in, and from that, there's the debate happening on the honourable member from Quebec, Mr. Fortin, his motion here, and which was dated obviously the 25th of March. So I can't see how we look at this, and also I think there's a if I can take a step back and not speaking for the entire committee, but speaking for my interpretation of where we are, there's obviously a disagreement in terms of looking at and in the interpretation of on point 5, the committee noted that the Prime Minister, that the committee noted that the Minister Pablo Rodriguez appeared on March 29th, 2021, instead of Rick Tice, after having ordered him not to appear before the committee, as mentioned in his letter to the chair, received by the committee members. I think there's a fundamental disagreement. No one was not ordered to appear. In fact, the individuals responsible appeared at committee, and I think that distinction is very, very, very important. Also, I spoke to this last time, the sort of idea that we can just, and we've seen that with other material that we receive, that we can just keep adding people to speak. So if I can, extenuate this, anybody that's worked in the Prime Minister's office, a Prime Minister's office, according to this committee, should be called to committee for a study, and we've seen this now transpire with this motion from Mr. Fortin, because this is based on events leading up to thereof, and invitations they're offered for individuals to appear at this standing committee, and then we received other material saying, well, this person should appear and that person should appear. Oh, but we're not finished. We're going to invite another 2 or 3 people to appear. And we've done this, and it's sort of, I'm going to use the word mind-blowing, but at the same time, sort of exhausting to have this sort of happen. And I go back to my honorable colleague, Minister Rodriguez. If I can just make sure we understand. Let me end my remarks with some wise words from that former Conservative minister, whom I have quoted extensively today. He is right. He stated this about the staff: they bring to us many talents, and I expect many of them. When they accepted their jobs, never imagined that one of their skills required was to stand up to the interrogation of a bitterly partisan parliamentary committee. As a result of the actions of the opposition today, like the approach of the Conservative government in 2010, I say here today that ministers will instruct their staff not to appear when they're called upon committees, and that the government will send ministers and stand to account for their actions. And I think about that. To me, it's like, hey, the staff members should not come to a committee to be interrogated. It has to be the members. And it goes to this this committee and this motion that there's a fundamental disagreement. So for me, the solution at hand is either one of 2 avenues, that when Mr. Fortin has the floor, that he, and I may be corrected on terms of parliamentary procedures, that he offers the opportunity for his motion to be withdrawn and there's unanimous consent granted, or that potentially there's an amendment offered where we can reach some sort of agreement to move forward. If not, in my view, there in this I would say, if the motion was to pass, the precedent of this, I think would be very bad. I don't think would add to. I don't think we would be. I don't think I would be proud of it. That's for sure. And I don't think we as a committee are doing. I would not be doing my job in representing my constituents and ultimately being responsible myself as a member of parliament. And I may use the analogy that I'm the one who's responsible for my office, not my employees that work in my office, and so forth. So that's the way I would look at that. The calling of these witnesses, I think, was in all matter of fact not the route that I would have liked to see proceed on. Nonetheless, it did occur, and it was the will of the House that this happened, and I respect that. Is there someone? I just hear clerk. I just hear a little bit of noise, but okay. Maybe it's just that the floor is not on mute, so I'm hearing the floor. Excuse me. So with that, Chair, I look at this motion, and I know my honourable colleagues will also have their comments to say on it. It is just not in line with what we've seen in the prior governments. Not saying that's a good or a bad thing, but in this realm, this would be a very unique precedent, and I can't accept that at all in terms of that. The ministerial accountability or responsibility is very important. In the House of Commons every day, there's question period. There's not question period to staffers. It's question periods to ministers, and when they're unavailable, it's question period to the parliamentary secretaries will answer their questions and so forth and fill in. And also, we've also seen, due to this in this committee, in the studies we've taken place, that individuals that have come to the committee have then faced unnecessary and unintended, potentially unintended, I would say, consequences from MPs' actions, which were unfortunate in terms of people then being harassed afterwards because of coming to this committee and so forth. And that was very unfortunate to see. So, Chair, when I continue to look at Mr. Fortin's motion and read it over, and obviously we've spent plenty of time on this. At the same time, the same issues, and I would say very important issues, keep coming up, and that being ministerial responsibility, and that to me is the fundamental premise where, at this current juncture, I can't support. Can't offer my support to Mr. Fortin's motion because of that. And I'm only one member of the committee, but it's my right to speak on it and offer my views on why I can't do that. With that, Chair, who our speaking list? Can you provide me the refreshed speaking list, please?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Cervera. Are you ceding your time? Are you ceding the floor?
No, I'm not ceding the floor. I'm just asking for revised speaking list. I'm looking at the clock, and I want to make sure we have other individuals that potentially could.
We have most of your colleagues that are waiting in the queue, so they enjoy the floor if you're ceding the floor.
Okay. No, I'm going to just offer my last thoughts for another minute, and then I will try to wrap up. With that, Chair, my viewpoints are well known on this topic on Mr. Fortin's motion. There are believe there are two avenues available for the committee so we can move on to conduct the work that we're here, including the study. I know that many of MPs are very passionate about. I know many MPs in the province of Quebec are very pertinent about with the organization based there. So with I say there are two avenues. One, that we seek unanimous consent to. Mr. Fortin withdraws his motion. We receive unanimous consent, or secondly, that the motion is amended in order to better reflect the fact of ministerial responsibility and also how we can move forward to make the motion pertinent to the report at hand, pertinent to the report with regards to the study on and to the original motion that was put forward. So I will stop there. I do know my wonderful colleagues have some remarks to provide, and if I need to speak again, I'll resubmit my name to the list on this motion, but I will stop there. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. Cervera. We'll turn to Mr. Fergus now.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank all of you, and certainly my colleagues, Ms. Shanahan and Mr. Cervera, for their comments, which have been very interesting. And these comments have also been very educational. I'd also like to come back to other interventions that were perhaps related to points of order, but I think that shows the public listening to us that it is important to have this sort of debate for those who are following our discussion in detail today. You'll see, and I'll be very frank here, that we do have this motion, and for several reasons that have been mentioned. And of course, I'm going to express my concerns with this motion as well. And that is why it's not acceptable to half of the committee members. We have others who are proposing, or we've got a colleague rather who has proposed a motion which for the other half of the committee members is quite acceptable. So that's why we're in this very tough spot. Half and half. Half for and half against. So what do we do in that type of a situation? Chair, and here I'm talking directly to Canadians out there. This is a situation where either we have to continue to discuss together and try and convince our colleagues that we have a well-founded set of arguments, or else we decide, as Mr. Sorbara has mentioned, to try and find unanimous consent to withdraw this motion, or else there is a third option, Chairman, where we can ask to adjourn the debate on this motion so that we can go on to other matters. And this means that we retain the full right for MPs to present this motion once again, put it up for debate once again, in the hope that it will garner a wider consensus so that we'll be able to go beyond this current deadlock. And Chair, if possible, because I know that you've been putting this question now and again, and I'd like to say to my colleagues that I also have a great deal to say on this motion. So, unfortunately, my comments will not be brief ones. In fact, my comments will be lengthy rather than brief. So I just wanted to warn you, if you're not interested in listening to me and you've got other things to do, please feel free to continue with your work. But I want to be very transparent with my colleagues, and I hope that will make it easier for you with your viewpoints. Point of order, Chair.
Monsieur Fortin.
Monsieur le Président, en tout respect pour...
Chair, with full respect to my colleague, Mr. Fergus, and I know that, of course, he would be capable of speaking about this for several hours to say the same thing 330 times, but he's already spoken at length on this motion. I think it was last week or the week before. And now he's announcing that he's going to speak again at length on the same motion. Chair, I think that this way of filibustering the committee is not democratic, nor is it respectful of the parliamentary process. Quite the contrary, and with full respect, Mr. Fergus, I think that this is lacking in respect, and it really is not in keeping with the noble work of this committee. As Mr. Fergus has spoken at length in the committee on this motion, as he said himself, and so I think that he should cede the floor to the next speaker so that we can finish this off and get to the vote.
Thank you very much. I think that's getting into points of debate, but I will remind Mr. Fergus that we are in the same meeting that you did speak in previously on this particular motion. So I will caution you that repetition is not acceptable with regards to the debate on the motion.
Et Monsieur le Président, j'apprécie votre...
Mr. Chair, I appreciate your warning. And if you find that at some point in time I'm repeating comments that I've already made in the past, then of course I'm open to accept that criticism. But I think that up until now, I have not repeated one word, or rather one argument, that would be repeating an argument that I'd already mentioned in the past. Like Ms. Shanahan, I have read through the minutes and I read through what I've already said, and I do hope that I'll be able to further refine my arguments today without repeating any arguments that I've already put before the committee. That is why I wanted to be fully transparent, and that's why I expressed my intentions for today, because I believe that there's a great deal to be said on this. Chair, if I may continue now with my presentation. There's more than one way of being able to dispose with this motion. Yes, we could vote on the motion at some point in time. We will get to the vote. If there are not any new arguments remaining to be presented before everyone, as I've already said, we could withdraw this motion on the basis of unanimous consent or adjourn a debate on this motion, and that would allow us to move on to something else. As Mr. Sabara, my colleague, has said, we could also present a motion to amend, or rather to modify Mr. Fortin's motion so that it's more acceptable to a higher number, or rather in order to obtain consensus within the committee. So these are different ways in which we can proceed. And Chair, I know that you would like us to move directly to a vote, and several times since we started the debate, you've done an informal poll amongst members to see whether or not they were ready to put this to a vote. Because in order for that to happen, and I'm not going to say to ignore because that would be pejorative, I want to remove the start of that comment, but rather to overcome the fact that there's several MPs with their hands up and several MPs that are interested in expressing their views during this debate on Mr. Fortin's motion, and they do have the right to share their viewpoints with the other MPs. And you've had to do this. We can try and put this to vote with unanimous consent. You've tried to sound this out within the committee, but there was not unanimous consent in order to do that. So, Chair, there are 4 main topics that I would like to raise today. First of all, on the substance, on the content. I'm afraid the speaker has been put on mute. Oh, sorry, Chair. I pressed on a button here, which muted me. I'm sure some colleagues were happy about that when I put myself on mute. But anyway, I've been able to overcome that technical issue. So as I was saying, I want to continue along the same lines as Mr. Sorbara by showing and presenting you with various similar situations and show you the argument that's been put forward by other political stripes other than my political party on this matter. And then at the end, Mr. Chair, I would like to talk about this question of accountability or responsibility, not just ministerial responsibility, but our responsibilities as MPs of the House of Commons, elected MPs, and a responsibility to represent the will of our constituents, or to make the best judgment that we can as parliamentarians when involved in this type of debate. So, Chair, turning to this motion from my dear colleague, Mr. Fortin, I would very much like to recognise that when responding to my arguments the last time round, when I was fortunate enough to take the floor back then, Mr. Fortin very skillfully came up with counter arguments. So I'd like to say bravo, Mr. Fortin. But there was one line of arguing that he didn't address, to which he didn't respond. Namely, it was the question of who represents, no, the Speaker tells off, not who represents the government, but rather in the motion that was approved by the House of Commons, there were two aspects involved. And Mr. Fortin has recalled this in various of his points of order, where he said either the political attaches come before the committee, or secondly, it should be the Prime Minister who should speak on their behalf before the committee. So what happened was that he didn't actually answer that question, because if the Prime Minister had appeared, he would have strictly adhered to the interpretation of the motion that was presented and adopted by the House of Commons with a majority vote amongst the parties of the opposition. But, Chair, he didn't answer this question as to who can speak on behalf of the Prime Minister. And the answer to that is his ministers, because the ministers speak on behalf of the government. That is a point that's been raised by Ms. Shanahan today, and then touched on very briefly by Mr. Sorbera. And this is a point that I had raised perhaps with less skill, because my colleague, Mr. Fortin, was not able to come back to that particular matter. So who speaks on behalf of the government? Well, the government acts in solidarity. Any member of the government can speak on behalf of the government. That is why, Mr. Chair, if it was acceptable to have the Prime Minister, it would also be completely acceptable to have another member of the government who could appear before us. And we heard the testimony of Mr. Rodriguez. And I remember that Mr. Barrett didn't even want to accept Mr. Rodriguez to appear on behalf of the government.
Parler pour le Premier ministre, pour le...
On behalf of the government, and he said that yes, indeed, we will hear from Mr. Minister Rodriguez, but we also want to directly hear from ministerial staffers. And in doing so, well, he is in fact putting himself in direct opposition to the spirit of the motion that has been tabled before the House of Commons. And to my mind, Mr. Chairman, that is the whole crux of the affair. And that's what is at the centre of what's going on here. It is regrettable. And they went further because points 5 and 6 of Mr. Fortin's motion do not, how should I put this? Well, we didn't even do Minister Fortier the courtesy of agreeing to hear from her. She also speaks on behalf of the government and represents the government, just as the Prime Minister of Canada does. So we didn't do her the courtesy of giving her the opportunity to appear before us. Now, with those two things in mind, well, it put a spanner in the works and we couldn't proceed with our committee business. Now, Mr. Chairman, when in the past the government found itself in a similar situation to today's, an individual said, and I quote, "Our precedents and our practices, our customs are very clear. Ministers must be accountable, both in the House and in committees, not political staffers. Political staffers have to be held to account to ministers and the departments for which they work." And I'll go on. He went on to say, ministers, on a point of order, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, our colleague Mr. Fergus is telling us who should be held to account in the House of Commons. He said that it's ministers, and no one is challenging that fact. But this motion refers to individuals who were called upon to appear, not to be accountable, but just to respond to a number of questions. And that's not prohibited. On the contrary, it's encouraged. This isn't a question of accountability. Nowhere in the motion do we talk about accountability or being held to account. We just want to know, we want to get answers as to why these individuals didn't testify.
That's, I do believe that that's an issue of debate, not an issue of a point of order. Mr. Fergus.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if I could just finish the quote, because I think it might be helpful to my colleague. So I'll just pick up where I left off. And I quote, "Ministers are held responsible and accountable in the House of Commons, and our employees are accountable to us." Who said that, Mr. Chairman? No other than the Right Honourable Stephen Harper, in fact. And he is celebrating his 62nd birthday today, and happy birthday to him. So, Mr. Chairman, when we say, or when we invited the Prime Minister to appear before the committee, well, in doing so, we were inviting his government, because the Prime Minister speaks on behalf and for the government, as do ministers. 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. So therefore, to intimate that we are dissatisfied, as the motion states, Mr. Chairman, is completely unacceptable to my mind. Now listen, Mr. Chairman. We need to find a way of disposing with this motion. And as I said earlier, there are many ways of going about it. There's many ways of skinning a cat. Now, Mr. Chairman, if you'd be interested in perhaps feeling out people's desires in this regard and perhaps getting a sense of the mood in the room, informally speaking, as to how our colleagues feel at this stage of the game about providing unanimous consent to have this motion withdrawn. If they'd like to entertain that, well, I'd be pleased for you to cut me off at this point and we could take a quick break so that you can do so if you want to. Do you want to?
Fergus, I'm already getting indications from committee members that there is no consent to do that. I see a number of heads that are indicating that they're not supportive of that. Thank you, Mr. Fergus. We are looking for creative ways to move forward, and that is not possible. It doesn't seem like it's possible to simply move on. So the only other alternative would be to move to a vote. And so I don't know, Mr. Fergus, if you'd like me to poll to see if there's a support for a vote now, I could do that as well. Colleagues, those that are supportive of moving to a vote on the motion now, I'm seeing some heads that are in support. Mr. Sobera and Ms. Shanahan are indicating that they do not support the idea of moving to a vote, Mr. Fergus. So it looks like we'll have to go through the speaking list. Just a reminder,
I see, okay.
Mr. Fergus, that there are several members that are waiting for their opportunity to speak behind you as well.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Well, thank you.
Recognizing point of order, Mr. Angus.
Thank you, because Mr. Fergus did tell us we could go off and spend our day doing other things, which I thought was very disrespectful to the committee because he was going to take the floor. But I believe we're down to about 6.5 minutes left. Is Mr. Fergus planning to go all night, or will we have a vote at the time that the committee normally ends to end this circus?
Colleagues, I will inform you that we've been informed that we cannot technically proceed beyond the three o'clock time. The House can't accommodate our meeting beyond 3 o'clock today, and so if in fact we do get to that point, I'll simply be suspending the meeting if we get to the 3 o'clock point. But we'll move forward. Mr. Fergus, the floor is yours.
Monsieur le Président, peut-être juste un dernier point.
Well, just a final point of order, Mr. Chairman, to accommodate folks and so that we can hear Mr. Fergus's remarks. Well, perhaps he can submit them in writing. In fact, all of the testimony, and we can read that before Tuesday. We'll have plenty of time. The work will be done and dusted, and if Mr. Fergus agrees, I'd be pleased to read him at a later date.
I think that's a very creative suggestion, and I think that the clerk will happily accept any submissions that she receives before the next meeting. We can distribute those, Mr. Dong.
Point of order, just to understand what Monsieur Fortin just suggested, is he suggesting all the Liberal members who's on the speaking list can submit what they have to say in writing? And so we don't talk at the committee. Is that okay. What he's suggesting?
I won't speak on behalf of Mr. Fortin, but that's what it appears is that he was suggesting. But Mr. Fergus, will return to you.
Point of order.
Recognizing the point of order, Mr. Angus.
Final point of order, being that we have been suffering patiently the abuse of our Liberal colleagues. Mr. Fergus, it's 4 minutes left. Could you just call the meeting so we don't have to listen to any more of this malarkey? Give us a break. It's Friday. Come on, let us go off.
Colleagues, that's not a point of order. Mr. Fergus, will turn back to you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the fact that you are standing up for my rights as a member of Parliament. all too often, and I don't want to seem to come across as not having a thick skin, but oftentimes people have encouraged me to quieten down, to zip the lip, and I don't think that was the intention of my honourable colleagues, but I'm sure you'll understand, Mr. Chairman, that I take that very seriously, and I really appreciate the fact that you are defending my right to speak about this issue, as it is the right of all members to do so. Now, that said, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Fortin would like me to put my remarks in writing. Now, I'd be tremendously delighted, in fact, to pencil down my thoughts and share them with members of the committee. It will take the form, Mr. Chairman, of an amendment to Mr. Fortin's motion, and I'll proceed to read it now.
That Mr. Fortin's motion be amended. That point 5 be deleted and replaced with, the committee noted that Minister Pablo Rodriguez appeared on March 29, 2021, instead of Rick Tice, who followed the government instructions that staff are not to appear before committees, which were outlined during the debate in the House on March 25, 2021. And point 6 be deleted and replaced with, the committee noted that Minister Mona Fortier also requested to appear on March 31 and April 8, 2021, on behalf of witnesses Amit Paul Singh and Ben Chin, who followed the government's instructions that staff are not to appear before committees which were outlined during the debate in the House on March 25, 2021. And that the words that the committee report these events to the House of Commons in order to express its dissatisfaction be replaced with, that the non-attendance of witnesses be added to an annex to the main report on the study of questions of conflict of interest in lobbying in relation to pandemic spending. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairman, I'd be delighted to distribute the motion, to give it to the clerk so that all members can take advantage of my thoughts on the matter.
Okay, colleagues, what we will do, as it is our custom in this committee, to ensure that every member has a written copy of that in both official languages, we will, I'll ask Mr. Fergus to supply that to the clerk, and that way it can be translated and distributed to members. I will then suspend this meeting because we can't go beyond the 3 o'clock time frame, which is in less than a minute. I'll suspend this meeting until
point of order, Chair. Before
next,
you do,
Mr. Dong.
Sorry,
we are running out of time, Mr. Dong.
Could you just quickly tell us what the speaking order is, so I have on record the next?
I will. Thank you for noting that. At this point, it is Monsieur Fortin, followed by Mr. Carey, followed by Mr. Dong, followed by Mr. Angus, Mr. Barrett, and then Shanahan, and many of the members that are on that, they're redundant. So that's where we'll start with. Pardon me,
Mr. Chair, Ms. Lattanzio.
Ms. Lattanzio.
I was on the speakers list as you mentioned me the last time you clarified the speakers list. So I just want to maybe ask you to revise your. I was right after Mr. Barrett. If that can be any help to you.
I do apologize. I had Ms. Shanahan. I meant to have you. I do apologize, Ms. Lattanzio. So that's where the speaking order will finish. So just so that we're clear, I am suspending in the next 30 seconds due to our constraints here, but it's Monsieur Fortin, Mr. Carey, Mr. Dong, Mr. Angus, Mr. Barrett, and Ms. Lattanzio. Colleagues, we will now suspend this meeting until our next meeting time frame.
Cover up continues.
Have a nice weekend, everybody. Michael, you included.
You're